listen, are there guys who make it to the big leagues because they have ridiculous physical ability and they don't put in, the work? Yeah. Do those guys last? Rarely. It's a hard game. And now it's, 365 days a year. If you're not putting in the work, if you don't have that desire, then you're not going to last.
What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Advocate Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Hannaford, and today we have a very special guest. If you are a fan of baseball, you have seen this guy on TV during the MLB draft. His name is Jonathan Mayo with MLB.com, and he is an expert, I've learned, in really three things. One is the draft, the second is the minor leagues and what a prospect looks like, and then the third is scouting. So what we talk about in this episode, which I think is extremely valuable for you, whether you're a parent or a player, is we touch on really how scouting has changed since COVID. We talk about draft modeling and what that really looks like. We talk about what a hybrid approach is for the draft for teams as it relates to the model. We talk about draft rankings. We talk about the MLB Combine. What it is it good? Is it bad? Should players consider this? We talk about the MLB Draft League as well. And as far as the minor leagues go, one of the things that we do touch on in this episode is Jonathan wrote a book. It is called Smart, Wrong, and Lucky, The Origin Stories of Baseball's Unexpected Stars. And we really dive into who some of these stars are, whether you're Joey Votto, Mookie Betts, Jacob deGrom, Albert Pujols, how all of those guys that I just referenced weren't those supreme prospects going through the draft out of high school, but they were somebody who ultimately got into the minor leagues and overcame a ton of obstacles to be the player that they ultimately grew to be. We talk about what makes a really good major league organization as far as player development goes. And also we talk about what makes a good minor league prospect. Lastly, we cover how does he actually create and come up with, as I said before, the MLB draft rankings, but also the top 30 MLB team prospect rankings. So if you're a fan of baseball, this is definitely an episode you're going to get a ton of information from. If you're a parent or a player going through the draft process for the first time, you undoubtedly will get information that you don't currently know. So again, as I tell you guys every single week, would love to hear feedback from you. Send me a DM, shoot me an email. I am here to help your life be easier. But without further ado, here's my episode with Jonathan Mayo from MLB.com. All right, Jonathan Mayo, thank you for coming on the Advocate Podcast. For all of you who are watching on YouTube, this is a face that you probably will say looks familiar.
I'm sorry.
You shouldn't be. Chances are, if they recognize you, it's because they are inundated with the major league draft or something about prospects. So before we kind of jump into all that stuff, I like to kind of start every podcast by asking one specific question, which is, what is something that happened in your life specifically that you think without it, you wouldn't be Jonathan Mayo covering baseball, doing what you do right now?
Wow. Well, I guess, maybe it was the first time I ever saw a real curveball and realized I couldn't hit it.
Right.
But I mean, if I want to go back a little further, both my parents were huge baseball fans. My mom, even more so than my dad. She was an only child who grew up in the Bronx, but was a New York Giants fan. And her dad was like, all right, I don't have a son, but I'm going to teach you the game. And she kind of handed it down. So I think the passion for it, is what led me to it, and then some of it was luck. Before I started working for MLB.com, I was at the New York Post, and, as a kind of peon there, was just grabbing onto the scraps and writing whatever they would let me write. So I could have just as easily, ended up covering basketball or football, say. I once talked myself out of being the Islanders beat writer, which probably was for the best because I don't know anything about hockey. But it was just kind of luck that I ended up getting the job with MLB.com, where, I've been very fortunate where the sport I'm most passionate about is the one I've been able to cover for the last 25 years.
Yeah. And you've had, we talked about this obviously offline, but you have a son who played college baseball. You kind of experienced the travel ball thing. So I'm curious, in your line of work, like how has having the insight from being a parent of somebody who played college baseball, how has that helped you with what you do?
It's probably almost been the other way around, although I've had to recalibrate, because I mean my son, was fortunate enough to play college baseball, and as I remind him, he's part of I think it's 7 or 8% of all high school baseball players go on to play any kind of college. But it was at the D3 level, and he'll be the first to admit he wasn't very good. And so it's just a different, I think it's a different perspective, so I don't know that there's anything that I brought to what I do from watching him, other than to realize that, when you see like the really, really good draft prospects, it's just a whole, pardon the pun, a whole different ball game. There's so much separating just, decent travel ball baseball that my son played and like the upper level of competition. And if anything, like when I sort of try to put them all together, it's recognizing how few players, playing in travel ball will go on to do anything, whether it's high level college, let alone, getting into the draft or pro ball, and that expectations don't often match up to what the reality is.
Yeah. So if I had to kind of characterize what it is that you do, there's really two things that jump out, right? You have the MLB draft, and I'll call you like an expert, right? You are somebody who is inundated in the MLB draft, and you also cover kind of the minor leagues and prospects and players kind of leading up the ladder. You've been doing this for, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, since like 99 or 2000, right?
I started doing like really focusing on prospects and the draft in 2003. Now the draft has always been, I was the first ever staff writer for Major League Baseball's website, and even back then, the baseball draft was a big deal because it was really only an online thing. This was back in 1999, so it was always a part of my coverage. And the futures game started in 1999, and I loved it. But it wasn't until 2003 that I kind of flipped the switch and became all prospects all the time.
Got it. So as you think about the changes that you've seen, I mean, me personally, I've been in the business as long as you have, it seems like, as an agent. And really, since there's been many changes, but since COVID, I feel like, just the scouting. And I would say that you're somebody who's been a fan of scouting and really an advocate for scouting. How have you seen really how scouts do their job change since COVID?
Yeah, I think it goes in cycles. COVID obviously had a huge part in it because there wasn't a choice, right? So there's been a shift somewhat towards having to rely on video. And I think that goes hand in hand with uh, the continued increase in using data and analytics to evaluate players. Now, I think the teams that do it the best, and most of them now have some sort of hybrid approach. I think there was a point in time, and why I say it goes in cycles, if you think about during the quote unquote Moneyball era, there was this sort of shift towards so much analytics to the detriment of just going out and seeing players. And then it, swings back in the other direction. The teams that do it the best have some combination of the two, where you're still going out and watching the player, because I think you need to have a feel for their feel for how they do things and what it looks like, in combination with all of the data, all the information, and maybe sometimes supplemented by people looking at video. But I think there's been a streamlining, and right now it seems, unfortunately, that a lot of teams are streamlining both scouting and player development staffs. And that's led to fewer scouts out in the field doing that work, and more reliance on sitting at a computer and watching a guy on video and writing reports that way.
Yeah, so I just had a meeting with a general manager 2 days ago, and I was talking to him about, we got into the draft, and I asked him a specific question just about generally about the model, right? The draft model. And I think for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what that is, a lot of organizations really, I feel like at this point, almost everybody has a draft model that essentially values certain things for their organization. And the question that I had for him was, would you consider you guys being kind of a hybrid hybrid approach with the draft model where you do rely on the human element, but you do want the data, or use somebody, and the organization that comes to mind is like Cleveland, which is much more model driven, more so than kind of the human element. And he said, no, we're a hybrid. He said, really where it's helpful for us. And he told this really fascinating story. So this guy's been doing this a long time. And, at one point he was an intern with a major league organization and they were hosting workouts, right? So Carlos Beltran shows up at one of their workouts right before the draft and doesn't perform really well in batting practice. And so they literally took him from the top of the draft board and they moved him significantly down at the bottom. And he goes, I bring that story up because what the draft model today allows us to do is that was a mistake that they made, right? Like Carlos Beltran, Hall of Famer, right? This is somebody who's a really, really good baseball player, probably should stay at the top of that board. But because he had a one round of BP that was bad, we ended up taking him down. So the draft model for them gives them much more insight into really, should we be being affected by this, any one given day or bad day?
I mean, sure. I think that's probably true, but the other side of that coin is the model throwing players out for, one of the things that my colleague Jim Callis and I are often on our soapbox about is the age in the draft thing where, if a guy is 19 as a high schooler, there are a number of teams that won't even consider taking a player like that. The most recent example that comes to mind is Brett Beatty. And we don't know what, the jury's still out, what kind of big leaguer Brett Beatty may be, but he's a big leaguer and,
Sure.
Got to the big leagues at age, 21, 22. So, it's one of those things where I think with anything in either direction, Matt, having that kind of sort of over dramatic reaction to whatever the information you're given is dangerous is maybe a little too dramatic a term, but like is dangerous in terms of deciding what you're going to do in a draft. So I'm glad that the model might help them not throw out a Carlos Beltran because he has a bad workout, but at the same time, that model may throw out a player who, we always laugh at a guy who's, he's too old. We can't consider him at a high school, but he's going to be a draft eligible sophomore. And I understand you have 2 years of college data to deal with, but that's suddenly like a hot commodity. Same player, it's like, so go out and evaluate the player. And if you think he can hit, and everyone thought Brett Beatty had a real chance to hit, but there were teams that would have considered him at all just because he was 19. And that happens each and every draft.
What are your thoughts? I would love to hear what your opinion is of the draft combine. It hasn't been around very long. I think there are a lot of positives that come from the draft, but just would love to get your take. Obviously, somebody who's kind of in the know in this world.
I went to the combine for the first time this last year. I didn't go the first couple of years because Jim always went, and it didn't seem like it was necessary. And I'm glad I went. I think it has value. I think it's not the NFL combine and never will be. It gets better each year in terms of just how they do it, and the efficiency of it and how productive it can be. I think where we're at with that and, and even say the draft league to a certain extent is that it's largely going to help any stuff that's done on the field is going to help the sort of day 2 and day 3 draft guys, not the high end guys. The high end guys won't even come. And if they come, where the value is it's kind of speed dating where you can meet with as many teams as you want to try to line up in the few days of the combine and have not just meetings with one scout or, if the scouting director does a home visit, whatever, but you can meet with everybody, so it's, general managers, assistant GM, scouting directors all in one room. And so then both the player and the organization can have a much deeper familiarity with each other. So when you're making that decision, when you're deciding to pick someone in the first round, say it's all about kind of minimizing risk, while knowing that is, the draft is the riskiest thing ever. So if you really feel that, how a player ticks from a, an organizational standpoint, you're going to feel more comfortable with, all right, you never know until they get out there, but we have a pretty good idea of what makes this kid tick, and we have a better confidence that he's going to maximize every amount of his ability once we decide to draft and sign him. So I think that's where like the biggest value is in the combine. It's not, no one's going to come to the combine and, blow the roof off the place and suddenly go from being a third rounder to a first rounder because of the BP they do, or even the all the different metrics that they measure with some of the physical and speed testing that they do.
Yeah. What I've noticed this year specifically, so many teams are actually holding a lot more workouts in the fall than they ever did before. Now, part of that could be because, there's obviously the rule where if you're getting invited to the combine, you can't do any workouts for teams after that. If you're not getting invited to the combine, it doesn't matter. That's fine. But I've noticed that this year more than ever there are certainly more workouts from these teams. And I would tell you, like, they're regional workouts. They're not having these national workouts yet. But I do think it lends itself to going back to the model, like them wanting, whether it's the force plate data or any other data they could collect, having it early and then being able to measure that against what it looks like closer to the draft.
No, I think that, it makes some sense. Yes, I think the rule that you can't meet with a player after if they're going to the combine, although then you meet with them at the combine. So it may be that evens out, but why not meet with them in the fall so you get that better familiarity, and that can help inform your follow lists. There's only so many trips a scouting director or even a cross-checker can make to see a player that an area scout likes. And you have a pretty good idea of who the high-end guys are after the summer. There's so much more competition for high schoolers and college players. So, you have an idea of who you think you want to target. And then if you can sort of get in front of them and get to know who they are, it's not that you would necessarily cross a guy off your list entirely because, I don't really like the back and forth we had in the fall, but it may help sort of, scouts all put together a sort of priority follow list in the fall of like, all right, who are going to be the main targets come the spring? Who are the guys that I want my bosses to come in to see? And I think that those meetings can help inform those decisions at least a little bit.
Talk to me, if you would, about, you obviously put together, as does your colleague Jim, kind of a draft ranking, right? What goes into that? Because I can't even begin to imagine the amount of legwork that requires. It's funny, and I've always said this, Jonathan, and this is a compliment to both of you guys. We're in the 19th round and somebody gets taken, and I literally hear you read off like a scouting report, and you've got it right there. It's wild. So tell the listener a little bit about what goes into that.
We get by with a lot of help from our friends on day 2. By round 19, we're not doing every pick. But rounds 3 through 10 we are. And as we say during that streaming broadcast, like, there's going to come a point in time where we've not heard a player. But what we do have are contacts in every region in the country. So, over the years, Jim and I have cultivated those relationships where we can lean on them. So when we get to that, we don't know who that player is. Yes, we have a lot of notes leading into it, but we'll also have people texting and emailing us over the course of that broadcast. So we may hear, Matt Hannaford gets drafted in round 8, and we're like, wow, we don't know who he is, but scouts, please help us out. And then we'll, either reach out to or hear from the area scout who drafted him, or someone from that area who will give us that information. As we're recording this, we're actually working on our draft top 100 for 2025. So we're in the process right now, and we kind of do it, I guess, sort of the way the teams do it, where, Jim and I split up the country in half. And in our areas, we'll talk to numerous area scouts about who are the guys that belong, and we'll get reports and all the information and multiple opinions. And then we'll run them by regional cross-checkers that we know. And then Jim and I will combine our lists, come up with a very rough draft, send it to national cross-checkers and scouting directors for feedback. And that's how we end up coming up with the rankings that we have. And, there are other people who do what we do, who do it based on what they see and, how they evaluate players. And that's fine. I don't think, there's just one way to go about doing this. But for us, we're really more collectors of information, and putting all that information together and trying to come up with the most thorough and robust look at what the scouting industry, what the teams think are the best players in the draft class.
Yeah, I agree with the way that you guys do it. I do think that's important. Even for me, as I go watch games, I played baseball growing up. I played in college, but I'm certainly going to rely on a scout's eyes or somebody who does that for a living more so than I'm going to rely on my own, to
Sure.
tell
I
me how
mean,
good a
and
player
listen,
is.
yeah, I mean, Jim and I have been doing this long enough. Like, we know what we're seeing for the most part. So, and we'll use that to sort of not break ties necessarily, but, if we have differing opinions about a player or we're not sure to move up a guy up or down, if we have a gut feel because but the fact of the matter is, like, we don't have time to go out and see all the amateurs over the course of the summer. We don't even get to most of the events anymore, but in PDP league, we've done that a number of years. I did the high school, Major League Baseball's high school All-American game. So I'll have a feel for the top high school guys, but it's not like I'm sitting and bearing down on them. I mean, I do the broadcast for that game, and inside secret is that when you're broadcasting a game, you have no idea. Like, you're just trying to get through the game, but you don't really. The game will end, and someone will be like, "Oh, who stood out to you?" And you're like, really don't know, because you're in the moment, and you have to go back and look at things and then talk to people. But we don't have the time, even if we wanted to go out into all of the events and do it that way. Like, the way our jobs are structured, we don't have the time to do that. So some of this is a out of necessity, but also, to me, like, I've always been a reporter, and so I prefer to rely on those trained eyes rather than my own.
So I want to segue into the minor leagues for a moment. So you wrote a book, Smart, Wrong, and Lucky: The Origin Stories of Baseball's Unexpected Stars. What's fascinating about this book is I actually worked with at one point 3 of these guys. So Joey Votto, Mookie Betts, and then Albert Pujols. So obviously I'm familiar with their stories, but I think the book is such a fascinating idea for me because, especially I think for the listener, there's so many parents who believe their son has what it takes to be great, right? And one of the things that you talk about in the book is chance. And the story, Jacob deGrom's story, right? Here's somebody who really saw himself as a shortstop. And thankfully, he agreed to go throw in relief in college. I think it was maybe a couple times. And he just so happened to be seen by the Mets. And he turns out to be Jacob deGrom as we know him today on the mound. So I would just love to hear your thoughts as far as, like, when you were writing this book, what you were trying to what stories you were trying to tell.
Right. I mean, so, as you know, Matt, scouts are probably the best storytellers out there. So, like,
Sure.
I just love hearing them tell stories. And, the more you talk to them, they're more likely to talk about the ones that got away or the ones they whiffed on. And, I love those stories too. But from a marketing standpoint, doing a book on the guys who were supposed to be stars who didn't make it, and you have cover photos of guys that no one's ever heard of, not going to sell quite as well, I don't think. But but the flip side of that are these guys who were the sort of undervalued. Maybe not everyone saw them the right way, or they weren't at big programs, or not everyone is Bryce Harper. Or Manny Machado, who I see the jersey behind you.
Yeah.
A top of the draft guy who go on to, Hall of Fame caliber careers. And so, I was very interested in, well, how did they get scouted and drafted? And it's kind of started when I did an oral history. It was actually during the COVID shutdown, and we were all looking for content and things like that. And Brian Bridges, who is now the scouting director of the Kansas City Royals, was telling me the story about how when he was an area scout, he drafted Charlie Blackmon as a pitcher out of high school.
Oh.
I'm like, really? Like, I didn't know Charlie Blackmon pitched. And so I started digging into that, and I did an oral history on how Charlie Blackmon ended up as a hitter, and he didn't hit until his senior year of college. And I realized, boy, there are a lot of stories like this. Everyone knows about Albert Pujols not getting drafted until the 13th round. Let's dig into that. And I wanted to show not only the chance part of it, but how hard it is to find players and do it the right way, but also how many people have their hands on deciding to take a Jacob deGrom or a Mookie Betts, or any of the players in the book. And then when I could also get the player's voice in it, in terms of what they understood to happen. And with, the deGrom story is fascinating because he pitched in relief. And my favorite part of that chapter, Matt, is he goes to play, when he goes to play summer ball in Florida for Davey Johnson and quits because Davey just wants him to pitch.
Yeah.
They had a shortstop and there wasn't room for him, and he quits. And then, fast forward to going to Stetson, and he's only going to pitch in relief, but he's the best pitcher on the team. So he, reluctantly agrees to start as long as he can keep playing shortstop. And, the only interest, I think if you were to ask Jacob deGrom now, he probably still thinks he could have made it as a shortstop.
Sure.
But it clearly worked out. And no one knew that he was going to end up throwing 100 miles an hour or any of that stuff. That kind of came later. I didn't have room in the book to really talk about the player development part of it and the player, buying into the development. He blew out and had Tommy John surgery the summer after he signed. So, but all of the stories in that have some element of I can't believe that happened to these players.
Well, so you bring up player development because that was the next thing I wanted to get into. What teams are better at developing players than others. What do you think are some common characteristics that make those teams really good?
I think different organizations are better at different things. And sometimes it just depends on who the front office is, right? Because there isn't always huge continuity. But I think in a general sense, the teams that do it really well have sort of the continuity from top to bottom. And it's something that I've seen teams struggle with, where there may be a philosophy in the big leagues about this is how we hit, or this is how we attack a pitching plan. And it's not the same from top to bottom. And then that causes problems because players get to the big leagues, and when you get to the big leagues, you're expected to help the big league team. It's a results oriented business, and maybe there's some leeway to kind of get your feet under you, but the hope is that when you call a guy up, he's going to help you. Otherwise, you're not calling him up,
right?
Because you need to win games. And if there isn't a knowledge of what is expected once you get there, that's a problem. And I think that ends up being a roadblock for a lot of teams. So I do think that there are teams that do that exceedingly well. And much like with the changes in scouting, I think those that incorporate all of the data and information along with strength and conditioning and the off-season plans and and things like that, those are the teams that I think have had the most sort of continual success of finding and developing players.
So I just had Bill Guyvet on the podcast, and we talked a lot about similar things. Basically, you have a kid, let's just say, who's in low A, and the example that he used was he's asked to bunt, he can't get a bunt down, right? And this is just one example. But if you're trying to build a championship organization where the kids that you're ultimately bringing up are going to be able to do a job, if you show repeatedly that you can't do this one fundamental thing at a lower level, I don't care if you're hitting 350. I don't care if you think you deserve to be in AA. If you can't do that fundamental thing well, if you can't be a good teammate, why do I want you around my big league club? Right. And those are the things we could all simplify it and say, oh, it's that easy. Now, we know, being in the business, it's much harder than that, right? Like when you see a kid as talented as some of these kids in AA and AAA, and that the major league club is not winning, it's easy to think, hey, look, we need to give this kid an opportunity. But when you really break it down to a World Series contending ball club, I think everybody needs to be smart enough to know, look, I do need to do the fundamentals really well, even at the lower levels. So the best organizations for me are those that preach that stuff from top to bottom.
I tend not to try to sort of talk in vague ways, but I think in a general sense, what you're talking about is developing winning players, where there's an expectation to win. I think this is, relatively speaking, kind of a newer phenomenon in player development, where it used to sort of be like you have your individual development plan And if you're a prospect, like you're just trying to become the best player you can be. And if your team is good, so be it. If not, not. And then there were some teams that would, stack minor league teams with older players so they would win championships, but it's not the same thing. I think now almost universally teams see the value in players learning how to win at a professional level. It's not the be all end all. It's not that like if you're on a minor league team that's bad because it's super young or guys get hurt or guys get moved up, it's not going to mean you're not going to be a successful big leaguer. But I think that there is an expectation, of winning that can be taught. And so that when you get to the big leagues, you want that to keep going. I think, I live in Pittsburgh, and the great example of that was when Andrew McCutchen came through, and they had some really good minor league teams. He was this back in the 2005 draft, which was a crazy draft. But the Pirates had some good minor league teams, and they really started focusing on, well, if we're going to change the culture in Pittsburgh, when they hadn't had a winning team in a very long time, we need to start earlier. You can't, expect a guy to get up to the big leagues and have this expectation. So when Andrew McCutchen got to the big leagues, he came with this, well, we win, period. Now, you need talent and all those kinds of things to go along with it. But that culture change eventually helped change the culture, at the big league level. And then they had the little mini run of making the playoffs 3 years in a row. And it was a small window, but I think it was an example of how that shift in teaching winning or expecting that can have an impact. And that, with that comes, the doing the fundamentals and being a good teammate and those things that you spoke about.
So you just got back from the Arizona Fall League, right?
I did.
And for those who are listening who don't know what the Arizona Fall League is, it is a league that they have in Arizona, obviously, at the end of the season. It's primarily the game's best hitters. Now, pitching can be a little challenging because obviously you have starting pitchers who don't, they want to shut down and they don't send them out there. But point being, it's a really, really good league to see some really good players. So my question for you is, we just talked about what makes a good major league organization, right, as a whole. What do you think makes a really, really good major league prospect? That's a very broad question. So let me get more, I guess, granular with you.
Okay.
One of the things that you mentioned in your book, and I think it was when you referenced Albert, was like this want to attitude, this desire. Is that something that you believe is a necessity for these kids coming up?
100%. I mean, how can it not be? Because, listen, are there guys who make it to the big leagues because they have ridiculous physical ability and they don't put in, the work? Yeah. Do those guys last or have the kind of careers that match up with what those tools or physical attributes are? Rarely. It's a hard game. And, and I think this translates probably across other sports, but I do think that baseball is unique in that it's much harder to coast.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might see in some of the other sports, and I'm not belittling them at all, an ability to carve out a much longer career because you can run and jump or throw or whatever it is from a natural ability standpoint. I think you can last longer in some of those other sports, but playing baseball is so hard. And now it's, 365 days a year. If you're not putting in the work, if you don't have that desire to be the best player, then you're not going to last. Maybe you make it, but, that's one of those things that I think people they don't always recognize, and I'll use Andrew McCutchen as another example, or even a guy like Bryce Harper, who was the best prospect anyone's ever seen from the time he was, 7 or whatever it was.
Yeah, the guy was on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a high school kid.
As a high schooler, and then graduated way early and, he went to junior college and hit a ton of homers. But man, that guy works hard, right? Bryce Harper just doesn't roll out of bed and show up and hit, right? Like that's ridiculous, and I think sometimes you can get fooled by guys who just seem so naturally gifted. You know, uh, Mike Trout had to put a lot of work in. He was terrible when he first got to the big leagues. I use that example all the time for people who think, oh my God, this guy was terrible over 20 games of his big league debut. He must be awful. I'm
Right.
like, no, it's hard and you have to adjust and you have to, go back to the drawing board and work on things. And it is a constant. You can't, there isn't any point in time in a big league career where you're like, all right, I've got to figure it out on both sides of the ball. So I think that if you don't have that that desire, it's not going to work. Not at least not for the long term.
So I see kids out of the draft every day when we go to some of these, tournaments and showcases. And when you get to know these kids, this is part of what you're trying to uncover as you meet these families. But there's a countless of them who they've got all the talent in the world, but you're asking them, do you watch baseball? Hate baseball, hate watching baseball. And it's not that, there's plenty of big leaguers that do that too, but I always get, curious. I'm looking for the Kobe Bryant mentality, right? Like somebody who just this is his life. He's a student of the game. That's what excites me. Maybe that's a little unrealistic, but when I hear some of these kids, they're just like, yeah, I play because I'm good. I know long-term, that's not going to be enough when you hit the wall to actually do enough to overcome it. At least not what I'm seeing yet.
No, I think that's probably right. I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule,
Right.
And that doesn't mean that they don't put in the work. So what it's interesting is there are probably some small people who don't have that passion, but will work hard because it's their job.
Mm-hmm.
And they're good at it. They found the thing they're good at and they work at it. That doesn't mean that they fill up every minute with their job.
Right.
And that probably works for a small amount of people, but I think you have to be wired a little bit differently for that to work, given the amount of time and effort you have to put into excelling at a higher level. It's exceedingly difficult. So like I said, I think that would be the exception, not the rule.
All right. So last question I have for you. Everybody I know who follows baseball, who plays baseball, sees the minor league top 30 rankings, right? Can you share with them how those are created? Is that a similar thing that you guys do with the draft rankings?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably more player development staff focused. But if I'm doing a team top 30, and there's usually some continuity, there's three of us, there's me, Jim Callis, and Sam Dykstra, and we split the teams up, and I oversee some lists that our beat writers write, but in a general sense, so year to year, you might have an idea, if I'm doing the Pirates top 30, which I do, I have a sense of who's on it now and who's going to be on it next year. So I have a foundation to start with. I'm not starting from zero. But so I might put together a bit of a list, but then I'll start usually with the farm director, the director of player development. And, ideally I'll talk to more than one person internally. So there may be someone, lower down in player development or even, pro scouting within the organization. Like, hey, what do you think about your own team? Sometimes as a general manager who has a particular interest in the farm system, and I'll run at least the order of the list by them. And then, in that conversation with the farm director usually informs the reports that you see and the grades. And then we'll run the list by each other and then also by as many external sources as we have time for. Hopefully one or two pro scouting directors from other teams, like, hey, what do you think about this team's top 30? And they'll give us some ideas like, oh, move this guy up, move this guy down. Hey, what about this guy who you don't have on the list? Maybe he belongs. And so that's usually kind of how we do it. It's an imperfect science for sure.
Sure. It's we get the question all the time, like, hey, what do these rankings mean? For me, it's always like, look, if you're on it, great. If you're not, use it as motivation.
Yep.
Right. It's no different than, a kid who's not protected on the 40-man roster and thinks that somehow this means he's not going to be a major league player. It doesn't say that at all. But if that's what you believe it to mean, naturally you're going to, be that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's funny. I was just working on a story that we do annually of guys who are not on the top 30, like not on a top 30, who did get a 40-man roster spot. And so, it shows you, first of all, we're the first one. We get it wrong all the time. Like
Right.
it's hard. Like we don't think we know everything. So we always chuckle when people get very passionate about this, on social media and things like that. And that's fine. That's why we do the lists. But like we don't think we have it all figured out. I'll put our lists up against anybody else's and think our process is really good, but that we miss all the time because of those guys who use it as motivation or take a step forward in development. But so we do, we do this list of guys who not on the top 30, but somehow were deemed by the organization should be added. And like over the years, Stephen Kwan was unranked, got added to the 40-man roster, and the next year finished third in American League Rookie of the Year voting. Right.
I mean,
last year's list had Cade Smith on it. And anyone who watched the postseason this year, like he was an integral part of Cleveland's bullpen. So, yeah, I mean, especially like those kind of roles, relief roles and things like that are hard to rank. But like, we're going to miss guys in that direction all the time, and we're going to miss guys in the other direction where we have them really highly ranked and they end up not making it. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, it is the nature of the beast because like this is how a scout misses on Albert Pujols, gets taken in the 13th round, and he is a Hall of Famer. So same thing, right? Absolutely. It is, as you said, an inexact science. Well, buddy, I appreciate your time, man. I know you're a busy guy. This has been really insightful. I cannot thank you enough.
It's my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.
All right, Jonathan.